Metroid Prime was the first game I ever played where the story was told almost entirely through written logs instead of cutscenes. Metroid Prime has very few cutscenes, and even the cutscenes it does have don't contain much plot or narrative. Instead, the story is told through these logs written by the space pirates in Chozo, where they tell their own story, in their own words, from their own perspective. These logs are hidden throughout the world of the game. You have to find them yourself. This is a really brilliant way of mixing gameplay with story. In a lot of games, you'll play the game for a while, then the game will stop and play a cutscene which tells you some story, and then the gameplay starts again until it stops for another cutscene. And the game will go back and forth that way, and the gameplay and story can feel very separate from each other. In Metroid Prime, the game never stops for a cutscene. Instead, you explore the game's world, and as you discover new areas, new upgrades, new items, as you solve puzzles and defeat enemies, you'll also discover the story. You'll find the story out there in the world as you're playing the game. In this way, the story and gameplay of Metroid Prime are perfectly in sync, in a way that a game told exclusively through cutscenes cannot be. Something else that really interests me about Metroid Prime's form of storytelling is that it makes the player an active participant in the story. You have to find the story. You have to search for it. You have to investigate the world, study it. You have to interact with the environment. You have to piece together the story for yourself like a jigsaw puzzle. For example, you have to figure out for yourself the story's timeline. Which pieces of the story fit where, in what order. This is something that's really only possible in video games. In a book or movie, the story will be fed to you directly. In a book, as long as you're looking at the page, you can't miss the story. It's always right there in front of your face. But in Metroid Prime, at least some of the story is missable. You can play the entire game without ever reading a single one of these logs. This story requires interaction and investigation on the part of the player, and that's a kind of story that can only exist in a video game. Of course, Metroid Prime's story is not told exclusively through these logs. Metroid Prime has a scan visor, with which the player can scan a lot of things in the environment, and everything you scan will contribute to the game's story. For example, in a space pirate base, you can scan a computer console and read their research notes. Or in the Chozo ruins, you can scan a wall ornament and it'll tell you something about their culture. In literature, there is a word for this kind of story, and that word is epistolary. An epistolary novel is a novel told through letters or emails or text messages or newspaper clippings or post-it notes or anything that the characters in the story themselves are writing down. One of the most famous epistolary novels is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Dracula is told through a series of letters, journal entries, and newspaper articles, all of them written by different characters with different information and different perspectives on the events of the story. Metroid Prime, whose story is told through a series of logs and research notes and wall ornaments, is an epistolary video game, and so is any other video game that tells their story in a similar way. The epistolary form of storytelling has mostly died out in contemporary literature. Many early novels were epistolary novels, but nowadays most novels are written in what has become a standard first-person or third-person narration style. But in video games, because of the interactive element, because they allow the player to investigate their world, the epistolary story has been undergoing a really exciting renaissance. A lot of video games have epistolary elements, and they're doing some really cool things with this otherwise dead storytelling form. For example, BioShock with its audio logs. That's an epistolary story. Or Prey, which has a mix of audio logs, written logs, and email messages. That's an epistolary story too. Or Gone Home, where you explore this house and find little notes the characters have written to each other. Or phone records, or Last Will and Testaments. And you piece the story together through all these little mundane documents. That's definitely an epistolary story. Any game where you're picking up logs or reading messages written by the characters is at least in part an epistolary story. The advantages of the epistolary form are that you get a very intimate view of the story. Instead of some distant objective narrator telling the story is told by the characters themselves. You can also get a wide range of viewpoints which can disagree with each other, contradict each other, offer different opinions. In an epistolary story, you can get a really layered and dense narrative. For example, in Metroid Prime, both the space pirates and the Chozo spend a lot of time talking about Phazon, but they have totally different perspectives. To the space pirates, Phazon is this tremendous new potential source of power, which they believe can propel them to military dominance. Whereas to the Chozo, Phazon is this terrible poison, with the potential to destroy all life on their planet, which must be contained and destroyed. And the game doesn't tell you which of these perspectives is correct. You have to decide that for yourself. There is no objective viewpoint here. An epistolary story is by nature a subjective story. The points of view you're getting are biased. I am going to dig into these scans and logs in Metroid Prime later in this video, but first I want to take a bit of a detour, because Metroid Prime also tells a ton of its story through environment. Through its setting. The visual design of the environment tells you so much about the space pirates and the Chozo, their culture, their story, what they've done, what they're trying to do. Anytime you're looking at the screen, even if you're not reading a scan, even if you don't consciously realize it, you are still imbibing the story. So I want to go through each of the game's environments and just look around, analyze what story the setting is telling us even without any of those epistolary elements. In this video, I'm going to focus on how Metroid Prime tells the story of the Chozo, how it develops their culture and history. I already did a deep dive into the space pirates of the game in a previous video. So the first environment you explore in the game is the Orpheon, the space pirate research ship in orbit around the planet. Does this space pirate ship, which has nothing to do with the Chozo, tell us anything about the Chozo? Actually, yes, it tells us quite a bit, because the space pirates and the Chozo are essentially opposites. They are cultural foils to each other. In storytelling, a foil defines by opposition. The space pirates tell us a lot about what the Chozo are by showing us what the Chozo are not. The Orpheon is this cold, lifeless, undecorated, artificial environment. There is nothing ornamental here, nothing recreational, nothing comforting, and most importantly of all, nothing spiritual. This is a fundamentally materialist space. What matters here is what you can see, what you can touch. This ship's spaces are utilitarian. Its design is all about practicality and function, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of what we'll see in the Chozo environments. The next environment you explore in the game is the Talon overworld, the surface of the planet, and there's an immediate dramatic visual change here. Whereas the Orpheon was cold and dead, the planet's surface is absolutely filled with life. The Talon overworld is so green. Everywhere you look, there are trees and roots and vines and plants, and all of this life is wild, uncut. You get the sense that Talon 4 is a rugged frontier planet, far from the centers of galactic civilization. And this is really important to the atmosphere of the game. In this game, you are alone. You are very far away from anyone who could help you. You have to overcome any challenges on your own. You are far out in the wilderness, and this is immediately apparent from the design of the environment. Here we need to take a long look at the Artifact Temple. The Artifact Temple is this massive boulder floating in the air above the impact crater, upon which the Chozo constructed a temple. The first thing you'll notice is that this sucker is floating. There's nothing to indicate how this thing is staying aloft. It looks like its builders grabbed a massive slice of the earth and suspended it in space somehow. This should visually give you a sense of the Chozo's power. They are a tremendously powerful civilization, extremely technologically advanced. The Artifact Temple deploys an impenetrable shield around the impact crater, sealing the poisonous Phazon within, protecting the planet. All that life we see on the surface is being protected by this temple. The Chozo care very deeply for the value of life. When you first enter the Artifact Temple, you'll notice this long horizontal window, which in design looks a lot like Samus's visor, which is of course intentional. Samus's power suit is a Chozo design, so you should see similarities between the two. I think it's really cool that, even if you didn't know that Samus's suit was a Chozo design, you could probably figure it out for yourself by examining the visual similarities between her suit and the Chozo ruins. And it's also really cool how the developers took notes from Samus's visual design when they designed the Chozo ruins in this game. When you enter the Artifact Temple proper, you'll immediately notice some drastic differences between space pirate and Chozo culture. There is so much ornamentation in the design of this temple. Look at these monoliths, at the elaborate patterns carved onto their surfaces. ruins. You can see the advanced technology, the metal, the lights. These monoliths do have a function, they aren't just decorations. But it's clear from the design that the Chozo cared about making their spaces pleasing, comforting, visually harmonious. Look up at these statues. It's such a contrast to the totally undecorated Orpheon. I also find it interesting that this structure is labeled as a temple. The Chozo were a deeply spiritual people, but not necessarily religious. We never see any mention of a formal religion, but we do see a lot of mentions of the spirit, the soul, of harmony, and we can find multiple Chozo temples in the game. A temple in real life is usually a place of worship, but I don't think worship is this temple's purpose. I don't see any space set aside for patrons to worship in. I don't see any idols to serve as the focus of their worship. Instead, I think that the Chozo's goal of protecting life, of containing this terrible poison, was spiritually important to them, and so this structure, which is first and foremost functional, this structure exists to deploy that containment shield. But to the Chozo, that is such a spiritually important task that they constructed it in the form of a temple, not to worship anything, but to honor and uplift their duty to protect life. And all of this information about the Chozo and their culture and their spirituality, I'm drawing entirely from the visual design of this temple. It's tremendous work by the developers of the game and a great example of how the environment can be used to tell a story. Next, let's move on to the Chozo ruins proper. The Chozo ruins are the ruins of a Chozo city on the planet's surface. So of course, there we can learn both a lot about the Chozo and also see a lot of how the developers are crafting the Chozo's story visually. The first thing you'll notice is how very old these ruins are. Look at the level of decay you can see in the design of these columns. They are crooked and crumbling. The internal supports have been exposed, and this decay, this crumbling, is reflected across all the ruins, the entire city. This is at least a couple hundred years worth of decay. No one has lived in this place for a very long time. Another key aspect to the visual design here is the desiccation, how dry and lifeless the soil here is. This is a dead city, and you can see that everywhere in the design. It's such a striking difference compared to how absolutely filled with life the Talon overworld was. Visually, this is telling a story. The planet itself still lives thanks to the efforts of the Chozo, but the Chozo themselves are dead, or at least gone. However, this atmosphere of death doesn't really persist in the ruins. You never find any Chozo corpses, never find any gravestones, graveyards, crypts, or tombs. The Chozo are not a dead civilization, they are simply an absent civilization. Compare this to the Luminoth ruins in Metroid Prime 2, where every direction you look you can find Luminoth corpses, or statues commemorating dead Luminoth, because in that game the Luminoth are a civilization truly on the verge of extinction. There's a very different visual story being told in these Chozo ruins. In these ruins, there are no discernible houses, no beds, nowhere to sleep or eat, no real living spaces. There are no farms or orchards here, no food preparation facilities, no dining facilities. Instead, it is absolutely filled with shrines and temples and fountains and arboretums and meditation chambers and reflecting pools. This leads me to believe that this is not a city in the traditional sense. This is not a place where the Chozo lived. Instead, it appears to be some sort of massive labyrinthine interconnected temple complex, a huge collection of structures whose purpose is the spiritual. Again, you can't really find any actual spaces for worship here, or any indication of a formal religion. The Chozo's spirituality seems to be something much vaguer, more personal, more intimate, more connected to nature. The Chozo seem much closer to ancient druids than to any modern organized religion. Just like in the artifact temple, ornamentation and decoration are everywhere. The Chozo ruins are my favorite area in the game for how visually elaborate the designs are here. I love stopping in each room and taking the time to notice all the little details the developers included. For example, in the main room on the floor of this half pipe, look at all the elaborate circles and spokes you can see on the panels. You can find decorations like these all over the ruins. They don't serve any function, but they add so much personality and beauty to the design. Something else really interesting about the design here is the mix of technology and nature. In spite of how dead everything is, there's actually a ton of nature in the Chozo ruins. All over the place you can see these roots twisting and growing through and along the walls and hallways, and they're so gorgeous. I'm always struck when I enter this particular room, and you can see the light streaming in through the collapsed ceiling, and you can see this tree's branches growing up through the ceiling. It looks so good. The Chozo have gone to some extreme lengths to craft a balance of nature and technology within their temple city. This chamber, called the Arboretum, is dominated by this massive tree growing in the center of the room. You can see a few spots where the tree's limbs are growing through the walls of the room, and you can see the way the Chozo have built the wall with extreme delicacy to protect these tree limbs. This tree was here first, and then the Chozo came and built the room around it later, but they did everything they could not to disturb the tree with their construction. They constructed the chamber in such a way that the tree could continue to grow and thrive, because they value life that much. This Arboretum also has a ton of ornamentation all over the walls. It's easily one of the prettiest rooms in the ruins. Like, look at all this gorgeous junk that covers every surface of the walls here. However, the Chozo aren't just a bunch of tree huggers living out in the woods. We already saw how powerful they were with the big floating artifact temple. The Chozo are a technologically advanced civilization, and you can find evidence of that technology all over their ruins. For example, this boss fight against the incinerator drone, a semi-intelligent garbage disposal robot that shoots fire because apparently the Chozo burned their trash. It's also funny to me that this drone identifies Samus as a pile of walking garbage, and so tries to burn her to death. There are these mechanical pistons all over the ruins still pumping up and down, which I suspect are part of a power production system, which pumps steam across the ruins. And I'll show you some more evidence of that. Look at all these elaborate pipes in the vault, with steam spewing out of them. And there are more here in the Gathering Hall, these ones with supports attaching them to the walls. The Gathering Hall also has electronic cords running all over the floor, one for each energy door in the room. You can find the Temple City's primary engine dynamo, which despite its age is still running and still providing power to the ruins. This thing definitely looks pretty advanced, and you can even see pipes running from its top up into the ceiling, probably connected to the pipes we've seen in other parts of the ruins. There's a whole network of pipes here, filled with steam powering any machinery still active in these ruins. One really small detail in the ruins that's easy to miss is that a lot of the rooms in the ruins contain these little scannable computer terminals that'll provide some simple information. The Chozo did have computers. Then there's this energy core chamber, which is filled with these extremely advanced looking machines with electricity shooting out their tops. So yeah, the Chozo ruins is completely filled with both advanced technology and nature. And one of the most striking examples of the way the Chozo have found a harmony between the two is the Hive Mecha boss fight. It's one of the first boss fights in the game, and it's actually one of my favorites because it's really creative. The Hive Mecha is a machine. It's a security drone meant to defend the ruins, but unlike basically any other security bot in any other game, the Hive Mecha does not fight using bullets or missiles or lasers or anything like that. Instead, what the Hive Mecha does is invite local fauna to nest inside its core, and then the Hive Mecha is so intelligent that it can actually train and work with that local fauna. This Hive Mecha has an entire hive of war wasps living inside it, which it uses as weapons. This is a really cool idea, and a fantastic way of showing how the Chozo have mixed their advanced technology with the natural world in a way that benefits both. Now, let's move on from the Chozo ruins proper to the Fendrana Drifts, the frigid snow-swept polar region of Talon 4. The Fendrana Drifts are totally covered with Chozo ruins as well, and a question I've always wondered is why? Why are there so many Chozo ruins in this area? There are Space Pirate scans that mention the average temperature in the Fendrana Drifts is below zero, and the environment here doesn't look at all comfortable. So why did the Chozo settle here? Well, all over the Fendrana Drifts you can find frozen waterfalls and frozen streams, which leads me to believe this area was once much warmer. I suspect that the asteroid impact affected the environment here in some way, perhaps altered the tilt of the planet or the planet's orbit in a way that caused Fendrana to freeze. I've always thought the ruins in the Fendrana Drifts have a subtly but noticeably different design from the ruins in the Chozo ruins proper, but I've never been able to pin down exactly what that difference is. For example, there are all these Chozo windmills in the Fendrana drifts that look different than anything you see in the Chozo ruins, but still have a definite Chozo feel in their design. I've wondered if the Chozo are a diverse culture and different Chozo from different parts of the planet simply had different architectural preferences. Fendrana also contains a lot of these small boxy structures, which look a bit like houses. We've already discussed that the Chozo ruins were a temple complex of some sort, so perhaps Fendrana is where they actually lived. The most prominent ruin in the Fendrana region is the Chozo Ice Temple. Once again, we have a Chozo building which is being labeled as a temple, which implies some sort of spiritual significance. Inside, it's hard to miss this giant statue of a Chozo in its center, and that statue is holding what looks like a big dish. If you scan this statue, it turns out that it is meant to depict a Chozo balancing the plane of existence in his hands. This suggests to me that the Chozo had humongous egos. They thought very highly of themselves. In this statue, they are single-handedly supporting all of existence. I think this is a temple that the Chozo dedicated to themselves, to their own self-defined role as protectors of balance in the universe. I don't mean that the Chozo were literally worshipping themselves, more that they believed they had some fundamental role in maintaining a kind of balance in the universe, and this belief was spiritually very important to them, so much so that they built this entire temple dedicated to honoring that role. Something else really interesting in this temple is that it contains 4 different busts, and each of those statuary busts represents a different role in Chozo society, and they tell us a lot about what kinds of occupations the Chozo considered to be important. The 4 statuary busts are a Chozo shaman, a Chozo architect, a Chozo philosopher, and a Chozo warrior. So these must be the 4 most important or highest regarded occupations in Chozo culture: shaman, architect, philosopher, and warrior. The use of the word shaman is significant. It's not a priest or a preacher or a cardinal. Those would be terms used with a more organized religion. A shaman suggests a much more tribal kind of religion. In real life, shamans aren't priests, but are instead intermediaries between the natural and spiritual worlds. I think the Chozo lived in 2 worlds, the natural world and the spiritual world, and both were equally important to them. So shamans, who are experts in moving between and understanding both worlds, would naturally be very important in that kind of society. Architect makes sense, since the Chozo are obviously great builders, and all of their buildings are so elaborate and ornamented. Philosopher is interesting. It suggests that the Chozo cared a lot about investigating the great questions of life, the great mysteries of existence. Warrior is also interesting. The Chozo were at their core a warrior culture, if only for the sake of defense. All of Samus's weapons are Chozo weapons, and they are extremely powerful. Which occupations are not listed in this temple also tells us a lot about their culture. For example, there's no mention of scientists, or artists, or writers, or musicians. No mention of laborers, skilled or unskilled. No mention of any kind of agricultural work. No farmers. No mention of any kind of domestic work. No mother or father. There's no mention of mercantilism. No businessmen or traders. No industrialists. Which suggests that all of these unmentioned occupations, if they exist in Chozo society at all, are seen as lesser. They are not as important as the shaman, architect, philosopher, or warrior. So, as you can see, a ton of the story of Metroid Prime is told through its visuals alone, before you ever even touch any of the logs or scans in the game. Any of those epistolary narrative elements, you can already know a lot about the story. Really, the visual and epistolary elements of the story work hand in hand. They enhance each other, tell different parts of the same story. Now, let's move on to those scans and logs. The journals written by the Chozo, which tell their own story in their own words, their perspective on events. There are 16 scans in the game which are labeled as Chozo lore, so let's look at each of them and see how they develop the story of the Chozo. Before I start, you may notice some slight differences between what you see on screen and what I read. I am showing you the logs as they appear in Metroid Prime Remastered, but reading them as they appeared in the European version of the GameCube release. The differences are extremely small and not really worth discussing, interesting. I just didn't notice the differences until I was already way too far into the video to correct them. Anyway, here we go. The first is titled Beginnings, Chozo script translated. The history of the Chozo stretches back into ancient times, so far into the fog of the past that we know not where our ancestors came from. One thing is clear, however. The Chozo who colonized Talon 4 made a conscious choice to eschew a civilization of advanced technology. We Chozo chose to live in harmony with nature, guided by the providence of the universe. We believe we will spend peaceful days here and plan to leave our words from time to time. Every Chozo lore begins with that line, Chozo script translated, and I really like this detail because it makes it clear that these logs aren't written in English. They are written in Chozo, and Samus's software is translating them. This actually has story implications because the space pirates' inability to translate the Chozo script prevents them from dismantling the energy shield that blocks access to the impact crater. The Chozo are an intergalactic civilization. Up to this point in the series, their ruins have also appeared on the planets Zebes and SR-388, but neither of those are their homeworld. Talon 4 is only the third planet we know of that the Chozo colonized. The Chozo are an incredibly old culture, and according to this log, even they don't know where they originated from. Their homeworld is long lost. But it's more than that. Their colony on Talon 4 is also really old. Apparently so old that they don't seem to know when Talon 4 was colonized. The phrasing here is really interesting. They don't say, we colonized Talon 4 and made a conscious decision to blah blah blah. They much more vaguely say, the Chozo who colonized Talon 4 made a decision to blah blah blah. The fact that they don't specify who those Chozo were, that they are so vague, implies to me that they don't have complete information. If I'm correct, this is really fascinating. Talon 4 isn't even the Chozo's original homeworld, but the colony is still so old that even its origins are murky. Also, that line, they made a choice to eschew a civilization of advanced technology, is at least kind of bullshit. I've already shown you all of the very advanced technology present throughout the Chozo ruins. They haven't eschewed all advanced technology. This means that, by Chozo standards, they consider all of this pretty impressive technology to be primitive, which further means that other Chozo colonies must have far more advanced technology than this, which isn't that surprising. I mean, just look at Samus's power suit. It is a ridiculously advanced piece of technology, and it is entirely a Chozo design. Later in the series, in Metroid Prime 3, we will explore Elysia, which is a flying Chozo research colony with nothing but advanced technology, and in Metroid Dread, we will explore ZDR, another Chozo world with some pretty impressive technology. The Chozo of Talon 4 chose to live more primitively, closer to nature. From the sounds of it, these guys plan to sit around, meditate, smoke pot, and make love to the trees until the end of time. The Chozo of Talon 4 were the hippies of Chozo intergalactic society. Many long years have passed since we Chozo first took root in this land. The passage of time has always been a source of fascination to us. It is the belief of many Chozo sages that the truths of the universe hide within the tumbling current of time's flow. Even as we search for answers there, however, we find illumination in other unexpected places. We know not how the ability has come to us, but recently many Chozo have begun to sense things beyond the realm of ordinary perception. Strange sights and inexplicable sensations flood us with visions. We take this growing ability to be a sign of our burgeoning harmonization with the infinite. Perhaps, finally, the universe's secrets are becoming known to us. Through their investigations into spirituality and the flow of time, somehow, by some method unknown even to the Chozo, they have come unstuck from time. The ability seems to be somewhat vague and uncontrollable. The Chozo can't choose when to see beyond the current moment, and can't choose what moment in time they see. And it's not just seeing. The log mentions inexplicable sensations, so perhaps the actual full sensorial experience of existing in a different time and place, the sounds and the smells and the feelings. Earlier, I dismissively referred to the Chozo of Talon 4 as the hippies of Chozo society, but it's clear from this log that their devotion to nature, to peace, and to spiritualism has actually led them to greater insights into the universe than a focus on science and technology ever could have. I'd also like to draw some attention to that line. The passage of time has always always been a source of fascination to us. We saw earlier that the philosopher was one of the most respected occupations in Chozo culture, and here we get to see a little of what those philosophers were up to, trying to understand time, which is a more complicated topic than it might at first seem. I think it's also important to note that philosophy can only really exist in a society whose physical needs are already met. People who are busy working non-stop just to feed themselves don't have a lot of time for asking big questions like, what is the nature of time itself? Simply put, the Chozo must have a lot of free time on their hands. Their physical needs must already be met. They must live in some sort of post-scarcity utopian society, where they don't have to labor or toil in the fields. Instead, they, or at least some of them, get to spend their time investigating the mysteries of the universe. Many Chozo are gifted with the distant sight, and even more begin to learn it as our harmonization with the universe becomes more and more complete. We peer forward, seeing prophecy in the ripples of the water, hearing rumors of coming days on the breath of the wind. Though we celebrate the distant sight, many of these visions are dark. The worst of the prophecies, and the most common, tells of the coming of the worm. Born from parasites nurtured in a poisoned womb, the worm grows, devouring from within, until the world begins to rot. Not all prophecies come to pass, of course, but we cannot help but fear this dark portent. The Chozo's visions of the future have turned dark. They see what they call the worm, a monster which will destroy their world. This worm could refer to two different things. It could be Metroid Prime, the final boss of the game, or it could be Phazon, the alien mutagenic substance, which poisons Talon 4's ecosystem. The two are so closely related that they're kind of the same thing, so it doesn't really matter. From a narrative standpoint, what's important here is that the Chozo's story is essentially a tragedy, in the traditional sense. Tragedy in literature is a genre that usually focuses on some noble character who struggles against external forces and ultimately fails because of their own flaws. The Chozo are collectively a noble character. They are strong and peaceful and good. The external force they struggle with is Phazon, which is destroying their planet. They do ultimately fail. They contain Phazon, but only partially, and they cannot destroy it. This failure can be considered a result of their own flaws. The Chozo of Talon 4 chose a life of peace and primitive technology, so when a threat arrived which required war and advanced technology to defeat, they failed. It takes Samus, a warrior wielding the most advanced of Chozo technology, to save the planet, something the Chozo could have done themselves if they made different choices. There's also irony in here. After generations of trying, the Chozo are finally beginning to uncover the secrets of the universe, but the only true secret they've managed to uncover are visions of their own demise. What they thought would begin the golden age of their civilization is instead the first chapter of their ultimate tragedy. This is a classic example of literary irony. The future is a vague thing, ever-changing and always in doubt. Even if we Chozo could gain the ability to foresee the future, it would be a hollow gift, for we could never hope to control what has yet to occur. The fountain is an example of this. The day may come when its water dries up, and there's nothing we could do to stop such a tragedy, but we do know this. Unlike the uncertain flow of water, the power of our will is strong and enduring. The will of the Chozo will never run dry. This is more Chozo philosopher ruminations on the nature of time and the potential curse of foreknowledge. This log is interesting because it seems to say two contradictory things about fate and destiny. On the one hand, fate is described as absolute. If a vision of the future tells them that the fountain will dry up, then there is nothing anyone can do about it. However, there is a suggestion that the determination of the Chozo is also absolute, that even if they cannot prevent the fountain from drying, they can do something else, work around the problem, come up with some other solution, outlast or outmaneuver the challenge. I mentioned earlier that the Chozo seem to have very big egos, and there's more evidence of that here. They are proud, they are sure of themselves, they are certain, not necessarily in their success, but are certain in their perseverance, that they will never give up. This is one of the few similarities between Chozo and space pirate culture, as depicted in the game. The space pirates have an insurmountable, almost unbelievable perseverance. Both of these cultures keep fighting in the face of tremendous failure. Both of these cultures simply never give up. I think you could also say that both cultures have an innate curiosity, but of very different kinds. Whereas the Chozo are philosophers, delving into the secrets of time, the space pirates are scientists, delving into the secrets of power and energy. Disaster struck suddenly. We had a vague, dark foreboding, and it became truth. A meteor appeared from nowhere, casting a dark shadow of debris over the land with the violence of its impact. Its destructive force spent, the fallen star burned itself out rapidly, and the incident should have faded into memory. But the meteor brought with it corruption. A great poison burst forth into the land, a strange energy that clawed at natural life with a ferocity. That strange negative energy emitted from the meteor expanded to encompass Talon 4 in a night, as a spider weaves a web. The Chozo actually saw the meteor impact in the spiritual world before they experienced it in the natural world. This is also the first mention we see of the Great Poison, the Chozo's term for Phazon, and the difference in terms demonstrates the difference in perspectives between them and the space pirates. Phazon is a neutral scientific term, whereas the Great Poison is a descriptive term, even more of an emotional term. Also note how quickly Phazon spreads. According to this log, it encompassed the entire planet in a single night. The rapid pace at which it spreads is genuinely terrifying, and something we'll see more of in Metroid Prime 3, where Phazon corrupts 2 planets in under a month, altering them in some ways that are irreversible. The cries of this dying land echo in our ears as we Chozo watch the Great Poison seep ever further into the living pulse of the planet. The dark energy sinks into the trees and waters, devouring all life. Peaceful beasts die by the thousands. Some creatures survive, but their forms grow as twisted and evil as the force that fell from the sky. Many of these mutated monstrosities remain small enough to do little harm, but others grow enormous and threaten our very existence. One such beast defiles our sacred fountain, disgorging poison from its foul form, replacing pure flowing water with cascades of creeping death. Even in the face of such horror, we Chozo do not turn in fear. We are all that stands in the way of this great poison, and it is our duty to contain it. As you read this log, the Chozo's descriptions of the way the rapid spread of Phazon causes a mass extinction event, destroying almost all life it touches. In what little it doesn't destroy, it twists and mutates. Remember how much the Chozo value life. We visually saw how much they cared about life in that arboretum, where the Chozo went to painstaking lengths to ensure their construction of that chamber didn't harm the tree. Now all the life they've been surrounded by, living with, growing alongside, protecting, is dying all around them, and there's nothing they can do about it. I think it's easy to overlook the emotional weight of this tragedy, but from the Chozo's perspective, it must be truly horrific. We also see more of that unstoppable Chozo perseverance and resolve, their self-declared role as protectors of the galaxy. Even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, the Chozo fight on. The surges of negative energy brought by the meteor far exceed our expectation. We Chozo have yet to find a way to rid ourselves of the great poison. All we can do now is seal it away and wait for the day when a power to purify the poison appears. However, it is already impossible to collect all the pieces of the great poison, as it has already spread, seeping into the planet and hardening. In this log, the Chozo appear to be admitting defeat, which is somewhat out of character for them. They quickly give up on actually trying to destroy all the Phazon, and instead focus their efforts on containing it, stopping or at least slowing its spread. They say they must wait for some other power to appear that can purify the poison. Of course, Samus is this power. She eventually appears and does destroy all Phazon on the planet. But the funny thing is, Samus is wielding the power of the Chozo. She doesn't have some power that is unique to herself. All of her weapons and abilities are Chozo technology. These Chozo did have the power to destroy Phazon on their own. You might say that Samus has some unique fighting prowess, or warrior spirit, or determination that the Chozo lack, but I believe Samus inherited much of those from the Chozo themselves. Samus was raised and trained by the Chozo. Her fighting ability and determination were honed by the Chozo. I've spoken a lot already about Chozo perseverance. Well, Samus has a lot of perseverance too, and I think she learned that from the Chozo. I think the real failure of the Chozo of Talon 4 is that they don't have the technology that other Chozo technologies had. They don't have a Samus power suit available to them. They chose to live in a more primitive society, and even though for many generations that decision allowed them a peaceful and spiritual life, now unfortunately they are suffering for it. The containment of the Great Poison. This task has fallen to the Chozo, and we will not flee from our duty. Even as we suffer with the land and its creatures, we will pour our will into the 12, the artifacts that, when brought together, form the lock that holds this great evil at bay. In the depths of the planet, this lock must stand up to all who might come to assault it, to preserve the power of the seal, and to protect it from those who would meddle for their own designs. We will spread the artifacts across the land, hiding them from prying eyes. The lock must never open until the day comes when the disaster can finally be put right. Here the Chozo speak more on their mission to contain what they call the Great Poison. I think this particular log is mostly a gameplay consideration, explaining what the artifact temple is, how many artifacts there are, and how to use them. This is all important information for completing the game. This video is an analysis of how the developers crafted the story of Metroid Prime, but it's important to note that the developers also use these story elements, the epistolary journals and the dense visual design, for gameplay purposes too, and this log is an example of that. Metroid Prime is a video game first, and a vehicle for a story second, which is of course what makes it such a good video game. That the developers were able to craft such a rich backstory for the game, when it wasn't the focus of development, makes it all the more impressive. As the Great Poison reaches ever further into the planet, we Chozo begin to feel the gnawings of despair. Before it is too late, we now make our last stand. We have begun to build a temple to contain this darkness. At its heart we will place a cipher, a mystical lock powered by 12 artifacts, and filled with as much power as we Chozo can harness. We wonder though, even when we are done, will it be too late? And will the power of the temple and the cipher itself prove strong enough to hold the poison tide that even now swells within the ground, threatening all life? I mentioned earlier that one of the few similarities between the Chozo and space pirates seemed to be that they share a common resolve, a perseverance. However, in this log we see a distinct difference between the two, at least as they are depicted in Metroid Prime. In the space pirates' logs, they never really seriously doubt themselves. Even in the face of cataclysmic failure, their belief in the ultimate success of their mission remains unshaken. By contrast, in this log, the Chozo are expressing serious doubt in the ultimate success of their mission. Even though the Chozo are a more spiritual people, they actually have a better grasp on reality than their space pirate counterparts. The space pirates are delusional. They are failures. Their mission will fail. On the other hand, the Chozo know their limitations. They are very aware of the possibility of failure. They don't hold to some belief that everything will just magically turn out okay. They might fail, and that possibility of failure terrifies them. Remember, the Chozo have big egos. They consider themselves protectors of balance in the universe. They're not used to failure. This whole ordeal with Phazon must be shaking their sense of self to their cultural core. What is this otherworldly pestilence that infests the land, seeking out life in its blind need for corruption? And where did the meteor that brought it originate? Was it crafted by alien hands? Or is it a roving chunk of a planet that suffered a violent end? Our minds quail in horror at the thought that long ago, in some corner of the universe as yet unseen by our eyes, an entire planet was perhaps once coated with this great poison. Whatever cataclysm may have ruptured that doomed place must have been mighty indeed. And if other meteors from it spread through space, bearing this evil to the far corners of the universe, we hold fast to the hope that this is not so, that the only surviving remnants of this evil are here, on Talon 4. Then at least there is hope for its eradication. Here, the Chozo speculate on the origins of Phazon, and maybe someday I'll have a chance to do an entire video on the origins and nature of Phazon, but not today, so I'll just do a short summary. The Chozo are almost correct here. In Metroid Prime 3, we learn that there is a planet coated with the Great Poison looming in the far corners of the universe. It's called Phase, and you actually explore its surface in that game. The Chozo are wrong in that Phase has not ruptured, it's still very much alive. Phase is a planet-sized living organism that reproduces by flinging pieces of itself into the universe. Those pieces then impact planets and transform those planets into replicas of itself, slowly consuming all life in the universe. Talon 4 is in the process of transforming into a second phase, into a planet-sized living organism. It's kind of cool. So many creatures suffer beneath the blight upon the land, and we Chozo are no exception. But for all of our pain, we can at least believe in the promise of the future. We have come to believe that a time may never come when we can once again open the door and banish the darkness we've contained. Even so, our vigilance will forever remain. We believe that on some far-off day, a savior will come and continue what we have begun. For that savior, we will leave our ancient weapons and armor. The soul who can gather them will be the entrusted one, the only being who can reverse the evil that grows here. The Chozo have come to believe in a savior, who they call the Entrusted One, who will come and destroy the Phazon that is eating away at the core of the planet. It's interesting to me that there's no mention here of what that belief is based on. You might suspect that they have seen some sign of this Entrusted One in their visions, but there's no mention of that in this log. I suspect that the Chozo may simply be basing this belief on hope. Everything else they have tried has failed, and so all they have left is hope. All they can do is hope that some miracle will save them. It's a very humanizing moment for the otherwise mighty Chozo. Throughout our living nightmare, as we battle with this unyielding darkness, we Chozo see a light. This light glows with promise, chasing the shadows cast by the Great Poison, and purifying that which has grown toxic. It is strange, though. At times, it looks to our eyes as if the light coalesces into the figure of a woman. Burning brightly, the luminescence descends from space, then retreats back into the infinite blackness from whence it came. When this prophecy comes to pass, when the light recedes, the Chozo's long vigilance of containment will finally come to an end. Here, the Chozo do have a vision of some sort of savior, though they don't explicitly draw a connection to the Entrusted One mentioned in the previous log. Towards the beginning of this video, I discussed how the epistolary story form allows the audience to see multiple and even contradictory perspectives of the same thing, and this log is an example of that. In the Space Pirate logs, Samus is described as the Hunter, this terrifying predator who has arrived to wreck all of the Space Pirates' forces and ambitions. In this log, we see a very different perspective. Here, Samus is seen as this brightly shining light that will come to dispel the darkness. Both of these perspectives are true. Samus is both the hunter, that predator who tracks down and slays space pirates, and she is this brightly shining light that will dispel the darkness that is Phazon. None know if our temple, the Cradle, will prove powerful enough to contain this evil forever. For now, it wraps around that abomination, cutting it off from the world above. However, we believe the power of the cipher, which has been produced by linking the 12 artifacts, should be strong enough. The fate of this world is now left to the one who will collect all the artifacts in the future. The time when the Entrusted One knows is approaching. This log is another gameplay consideration, another example of the developers using the epistolary elements of the story to convey information necessary to the gameplay, and it's mostly repeating information we already know about the artifacts, their purpose, and how they are used. The only new information we have here is that the Chozo know this artifact temple as the Cradle. To the Entrusted One. If you read these words, then our hope has not been in vain. Your path is fraught with danger. Monstrosities beyond description lurk in the shadows, starving, hunting for prey, searching for ways to quench the poisonous urges that bloom in their brains. Some of these are shrewd, but they are blinded by their evil designs. Believing in the black promise of the great poison, they seek to harness it for their own ends. It is these last that are the greatest danger. When you rid the universe of these creatures, adventures, you will be the true entrusted one. This is the first and only time when the Chozo mention the space pirates. I think it's worth contrasting this to how the space pirates describe the Chozo. In their logs, the space pirates speak of the Chozo purely in terms of how they can use what the Chozo have left behind, purely in utilitarian terms. They don't care much of anything about the Chozo themselves one way or the other, and even plan on eventually destroying all of the Chozo ruins on the planet, calling them ugly. The Chozo describe the space pirates as shrewd, meaning cunning, tricky, having a sharp judgment in practical matters, and this really is the perfect descriptor for the space pirates. They are all of those things to a T. The Chozo also say that the space pirates have been blinded by their evil designs, and this too is absolutely true. The space pirates very literally destroy themselves in their pursuit of domination, and ultimately are destroyed by their use of Phazon. For all of their intelligence, they are incapable of understanding the scale of the danger they are approaching in Phazon. They are blinded by dreams of galactic conquest, unable to see the disaster developing right in front of their eyes. The Chozo have a much deeper understanding of the space pirates than the space pirates do of the Chozo. But of course they do. The space pirates don't even try to understand the Chozo. For all of their curiosity, they aren't interested in that form of understanding. Things bound to earthly shapes are temporal and frail, existing in a single dimension. They are fragile, vulnerable, and ultimately mortal. However, not all things obey this law. Shapeless, they wait beyond the realm of perception, emerging only when one arrives who can feel their presence. Such is the will of the Chozo. Our will to defeat the evil seeping into this planet remains. We desire only to see the darkness meet its end. The will of the Chozo has no mind or reasoning of its own, though. This will be the entrusted one's trial. I've spoken a lot about how the Chozo seem to exist in two different worlds, the natural physical world and a separate spiritual realm. Here we get an explanation for the Chozo ghosts. The Chozo ghosts are not literally ghosts in the traditional sense. They are not the lingering souls of individual dead Chozo. Instead, they are the lingering resolve of all of the Chozo, remaining even when the Chozo themselves are gone. Echoes from the spiritual realm interacting with the natural world, mindlessly pursuing the Chozo's goals, defending their artifacts from trespassers, and testing the entrusted one to ensure she is strong enough to defeat the worm. The power of our temple and the 12 artifacts has sealed an evil in the depths of this planet. However, the future is cloudy to us, a world of veils where dark apparitions flit in the shadows. Within this strange world, one image stands out in the mist, flickering throughout the landscape, wraith-like. It is a human, a lone figure shining in the toxic shadows. We Chozo do not know what it is, but our hearts swell with hope at the promise of that glowing light. We will place our faith in our shrine. We will be there when the light shines again upon our land. Here we get the Chozo's clearest description of Samus, a lone figure shining in the toxic shadows. In the original North American version of these logs, the Chozo actually recognized Samus. They knew who she was. They called her the newborn and the hatchling, which matches their parental role in her life. It never made a lot of sense, because Samus was raised by the Chozo of Zebes, not the Chozo of Talon 4, which I assume is why it was changed in later releases of the game. Even with the plot hole, there was an intimacy and familiarity in those old logs between Samus and the Chozo that has since been lost, and which I do miss. Newborn and hatchling felt like affectionate terms of endearment, and it added an emotional weight to the story, where Samus was fulfilling the hope of her mentors. And that emotional weight is still there. Samus is still fulfilling the hope of these long-gone Chozo, who sacrificed so much to seal the great poison, and waited so long for her arrival. Something you won't see in any of these scans, though, is an explanation for the Chozo's ultimate fate. In the original North American release, there is a log in which the Chozo say they have ascended beyond the physical realm and will live on forever in the spiritual realm instead. But that isn't here anymore. Instead, these newer versions of the game are totally silent on the question of their fate. Are the Chozo all dead? Did Phazon kill them? Did they depart from the planet? Did they ascend to another plane of existence? To be honest, none of these are very satisfying explanations for me, and I struggle to understand why the developers chose to end their story in this vague way. I usually like open-ended conclusions, but this feels less open-ended and more just completely blank. But anyway, this was my essay examining the ways Metroid Prime tells its story. I hope I managed to thoroughly demonstrate the ways the developers used both epistolary elements and visual elements to tell what is a surprisingly rich and dense narrative. I do want to continue this analysis with the sequels. The exciting thing about the Metroid Prime trilogy is that the developers' storytelling capabilities noticeably improved over the course of the series. Their use of these epistolary and visual elements becomes much more confident and dynamic in each entries, and the stories they tell get even richer and more mature in Metroid Prime 2 and 3, and I really look forward to discussing them in detail, and I hope you do too.